Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, September 22nd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a variety of different national forecasts for the 2024 presidential election. The forecasts we are going to be looking at today are the Economist forecast, the head-to-head national 2024 race, the race to the White House forecast, Nate Silver's forecast, the FiveThirtyEight forecast, and JHK forecast here, an overall network of forecasts that have come in alignment on one consistent conclusion through a variety of months of gauging this race, looking at polls, looking at fundraising data, looking at fundamentals, and one thing they all come to a conclusion on, and that is Kamala Harris is likely to be the next president of the United States. Now, the FiveThirtyEight forecast is the forecast that has been the one that we have been studying the most on this channel. They released their forecasting model quite early on in the 2024 election season, and we've been tracking it over time. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to look back on those Joe Biden versus Donald Trump matchup numbers, but they also did come into alignment at different periods of time. But FiveThirtyEight's forecast was the one that was pretty consistently and pretty adamant that Joe Biden had a higher chance of victory than some people might have suggested. But ultimately, that's not what we're focused on here. What we are focused on right now is an alignment that is coming to a conclusion of very similar chances and odds across routine battleground states based on similar numbers, similar data points, but different ways of modeling and forecasting an election that again come to the same conclusion that might reveal a lot about the current state of the race. So just going through these forecasts, I'm going to go one by one to just take a look at the national headlines. What are they saying in the head-to-head forecast? We'll get into some of the statewide numbers, some of the more important nitty-gritty stuff. But right now, what I'm focused on is this Harris versus Trump number as to who thinks, who's going to win and by what margin. Now, let's start off with The Economist. You just saw FiveThirtyEight, but we'll get back to that in just a moment. The Economist here has roughly a 60% chance for Kamala Harris to win the presidency, largely in line with what we've been seeing so far, but let's see how much that stacks up against other forecasting models. Donald Trump at just a 2 in 5 chance, or 40% nationwide. The race to the White House forecast, roughly similar. 61% chance for Kamala Harris and a 39% chance for Donald Trump on the national forecast. On FiveThirtyEight, 60 to 40, very similar to the two most recent ones we looked at, again, race to the White House and The Economist. Then taking a look at JHK forecast, 57% to 43%, rounding up to 60, roughly even with that of previous forecasting models. And then comes in Nate Silver, which still shows Kamala Harris with a 54% chance of Electoral college victory, Donald Trump at 46%. So as I was saying, the models here are pretty consistent. They show Kamala Harris with the upper hand over former President Trump. And while there's a high end on one end, when you could see on the race to the White House at 61% and on the low end, 54%, it all hovers around the idea and again, that similar conclusion that Kamala Harris will be the next president of the United States. But while national headlines and national numbers are something that I think are always really important to look at, I am so interested in where each forecasting model thinks the pathway to victory really lies for both of these candidates. Now, the unfortunate thing about Nate Silver's model is that you have to pay to take a look at some of their statewide models here. It's an unfortunate reality, but it really just is what you have to do when you're no longer associated with 538 or a major news network, right? It makes sense, right? Nate Silver is not doing this thing for free. And so it makes sense that he's putting a paywall behind it. With that being said, I don't have the odds on hand to take a look at some of these battleground states, but what I do remember is that the better performing states for Kamala Harris come in at states like Michigan, come in at states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And if she was to have that electoral college victory, the pathway does not lie through Georgia, does not lie through Arizona, does not lie through North Carolina. And so I think this is really where we've seen Kamala Harris at a really strong position on the Nate Silver forecast, but I also think it's still valuable to take a look at the 4 other forecasts here that are nearly as reputable, if not as reputable, as the Nate Silver forecast that can, again, dive us deep a little bit more into understanding about some of these battleground states and how they might be predicted to vote. And so we're going to go through all of the swing states first on The Economist, just as we have been so far. In the state of Michigan, the expectations for Kamala Harris is that she wins by 2 and that she has a 60% chance of winning here. Michigan actually has been running roughly even with that of the national average for Kamala Harris. As we continue through, we can get through some other battleground states. We go over to a state like Nevada. Kamala Harris is roughly a 60% chance of winning there. The state of Wisconsin, a 60% chance of winning there. In Pennsylvania, just a 51% chance of winning here. Very, very narrow in comparison to where it was before. Not even back in 2020 is that where it was before. In Arizona, Donald Trump has a 60% chance of winning. And in Georgia, a 60% chance of winning. And in North Carolina, a 60% chance of winning as well. And so the odds and expectations here for Donald Trump have, been quite high in states like North Carolina, quite high in states like Georgia, quite high in states like Arizona. And while we have absolutely seen a narrowing, I mean, you can even see it here from September 12th, what was a 64% chance for Donald Trump right after the debate tanked to 53% recently, now hovered it right back up to 56%. It's a close race in Arizona, but ultimately Donald Trump has lost ground. But ultimately Kamala Harris has made some improvements. You can see here, in terms of the chance of winning, that Kamala Harris went from being in the negatives right up until the debate to being in the positives on the Economist forecast. Wisconsin is a similar story where Kamala Harris is at a higher point now than she was before the debate. Nevada, similar story too. She was actually losing right up around the debate, all of a sudden surged in terms of expectation. And Michigan, very similar, where she was at a lower point before the debate, now at her highest point ever in the campaign season. And so why I think this matters is because it shows that the pathway to the victory for Kamala Harris is very similar to that of Nate Silver's model, in that it relies on Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and that Donald Trump is the favorite in Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. And I also think, too, the reason why this matters is because in terms of the average number of electoral votes that Kamala Harris is expected to win, 277 is actually roughly in line with exactly what those battleground states would give Kamala Harris. I mean, this isn't just an arbitrary number. This is truly the average because that is what the, aggregate is giving us based on the odds in every battleground state. And so 277 is roughly on par with what we can expect to see in an electoral map if The Economist ends up being correct. And so as I was saying with Nate Silver, same exact result here. This 54% chance of victory predicts to roughly 279 electoral votes for Kamala Harris, roughly even with that 276 number that those battleground states would entail should she win them in its entirety. And so where are we at? The Economist and Nate Silver roughly in alignment on that as well. And the race of the White House forecast isn't that different either. Michigan is a state that Kamala Harris would have a 71% chance of winning. In Pennsylvania, a 66% chance of winning. Wisconsin, a 65% chance of winning. Nevada, a 65% chance of winning. But when it comes down to other states, like North Carolina, Donald Trump holds the upper hand, 54%. Georgia, Donald Trump holds the upper hand, 55%. Arizona, Donald Trump holds the upper hand, 51%. And while the margins here are certainly very narrow, right? Arizona is down to just 0.06%, meaning less than a tenth of a percentage. You're talking just less than 5,000 votes across 2 million plus cast in that state. Arizona is very much a toss-up with Donald Trump leading. In Georgia, the margin here is expected to be just as narrow as it was in 2020, but Donald Trump in the advantage. North Carolina expected to be narrower than Georgia, but Donald Trump still in the advantage. And so what this electoral map looks like, again, is very similar, except the projection in terms of electoral votes for Kamala Harris is slightly higher. 289.5 electoral votes, which would give her maybe a state like Arizona or Georgia that would boost her up there. But ultimately, based on where she is the favorite to win across the country, her states would give her 276 electoral votes in this election, which right now means race to the White House. The Economist and Nate Silver are aligned on this forecast as well. And JHK Forecast is also a reputable site, too, that takes a look deep at some of these battleground states. And as you might have expected, the story is very, very similar. Wisconsin, Kamala Harris, 56% chance of winning. Michigan, 64. Pennsylvania, 58. Nevada, 56. But Arizona, Trump holds the upper hand. Georgia, Trump. North Carolina, Trump. Final map here, 57% chance of odds for Kamala Harris. Average number of electoral votes, 285 to 253. And based on these numbers, if you were to just throw them on, what you would find is 276. An electoral college victory for Kamala Harris, but again, roughly in line with what everybody else is saying. And then we can take a look at the one that we have been studying for the longest time on this channel, and that is the FiveThirtyEight forecast, which shows Kamala Harris with a 60% chance of winning against the former president. And what do we see on this win probability in the battleground states? You guessed it. Pennsylvania, 58% chance for Kamala Harris. Michigan, 64% chance for Kamala Harris. Wisconsin, 61% chance for Kamala Harris. Nevada, 57% chance for Kamala Harris. But when it comes down to North Carolina, they're even. In Georgia, they're even. And in Arizona, they're even. Trump holds the narrow upper hand in Georgia and Arizona. Ultimately, the pathway to victory for Kamala Harris lies in the same exact states that it lies in on every other forecast. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada, bringing us to an average of a forecast here of Kamala Harris receiving 276 electoral votes. The average here, though, because they're saying that in a 50-50 chance, chances are she wins Georgia or North Carolina or Arizona, which would push her up there. Same thing with many of these other models. At the end of the day, things are consistent here, and that the pathway to the victory for Kamala Harris right now lies through those specific battleground states that I just mentioned. And in terms of the political betting markets, which I know we didn't say we would talk about too heavily, and we're not going to spend too much time talking about them, but they do also tell a story that is worth listening to even slightly. And that is a forecast map that has actually changed quite tremendously over the past month and a half. Kamala Harris went from a point when she was first announced as the Democratic nominee to be, the next president of the United States. She went from a 29% chance to roughly 37%. Donald Trump still very much had the upper hand. And we saw that when she officially won the nomination, and around the time of the convention, she was only at 47% compared to today. And the trend lines weren't super great. She was increasing, but then she was decreasing. And then, up until now, she has now reached her higher point over the past month, and a point that is likely to continue to increase based on some of these data points we've been seeing out of battleground states that have really shown good results for Kamala Harris. But in terms of the electoral forecast, I think you might find this interesting as well. The state of Nevada actually shows Kamala Harris with just a 2-point advantage, a little bit less than what some of the other states are showing. Arizona, though, shows Donald Trump with a 61% chance, Georgia with a 58% chance, North Carolina with a 56% chance. Now, Polymarket leans a little bit to the right. They far overestimate the odds and chances of Republican candidates of winning in battleground Senate races, battleground House races, battleground gubernatorial races. I mean, even at different points in time, back in mid-July, they had Mark Robinson, you might recognize his name because of the scandals that have been plaguing his candidacy for the past few days. But he had a 40% chance of winning in July, 45% chance of winning. His chance of winning today is less than 10%, and really anyone could have told you that. We knew that many of these things were going to become more popular and more known across the state, but many people didn't listen because a lot of people who do invest in these sites, again, do try to put aside their own personal biases, but Polymarket, I have noticed, leans a little bit to the right when it comes down to this and is tracked actively by many right-wing actors, which makes sense that, when you look at other sites like PredictIt, they are far more reasonable and end up being a little bit more accurate than many of the other sites here. And I'm not here to raw dog on Polymarket, but I am going to say, I do notice some things when it comes down to moments that really don't make sense as improvements. For Donald Trump, for instance, on debate night, his odds went up, and everybody knows that's what the right wing was promising. Oh, he went up, he went up, he went up. Every poll and every data point said he went down, he went down, he went down. And Polymarket now is getting back to reality here, but back to that point, even in this scenario where it's a little bit more favored towards Republicans, guess what it's finding us? It's finding us that Wisconsin is Kamala Harris ahead. Nevada already said had Kamala Harris ahead. Michigan has Kamala Harris ahead, and so does the state of Pennsylvania. And what does that look like on an electoral map if she's losing every other state? You guessed it, say it with me, 276 electoral votes for the White House. Donald Trump would not win re-election, and it would be a point, too, that would show Kamala Harris in the narrowest of victories in terms of what could be good for Kamala Harris's campaign. But still, a victory is a victory. And so, what I think we can take away from a lot of these different metric points, despite the models taking in similar data, they all try to analyze and understand elections very differently, and in many cases they do so accurately. But a lot of forecasts, and many of these forecasts, rarely ever do coincide to a point where they are nearly spot on in terms of what states they expect Kamala Harris to win, spot on in terms of, how they win. The fact is, we are seeing an alignment of these forecasting models that is very, very clear. I mean, it is something that I really can't separate from because I don't even think that we're at a point where they are disagreeing with us at really any of the reputable polling or major prediction firms. And the consensus map is building. The consensus map is building that Kamala Harris wins the White House through the Rust Belt region and through Nevada. The consensus is building that across all of these different sites, people with different backgrounds, people with different experiences, people with different models, people with different funders, and whatever it might be, all of them arrive at the same conclusion. One, that Kamala Harris wins the presidency. The second conclusion is that she wins the presidency through a unique electoral pathway that relies on the blue wall staying the blue wall, and the state of Nevada reverting to its electoral history and electoral path of being a pretty strong Democratic state. Republicans haven't won it on the presidential level since 2004. Not even Donald Trump in 2016 had enough enthusiasm and a shock factor that he was able to shift the state of Nevada. Didn't shift that much from Barack Obama, and between 2016 and 2020, stayed roughly even for that of the Democratic Party. Something that likely contributes to the model's forecasting across of them that say that Kamala Harris has the upper hand in Nevada. Ultimately, I think that this map is the most probable one today. I think North Carolina is a bit more iffy than we'd let on, especially with Mark Robinson in the fray. But ultimately, these forecasting models give us a very similar conclusion for a variety of different reasons. And I think they're right. The Kamala Harris has the narrow upper hand. This race is still very much a toss-up. But if the election was held today, I'd call her the winner. And I think she'd win these 3 states, Nevada, and I'd still throw in North Carolina, but only by a very, very narrow margin. Beyond that, right now, Kamala Harris is in a position where she can expand on states that Biden won in 2020, might lose some states that Biden won in 2020. Ultimately, though, she still maintains that very narrow advantage that puts her as the victor of this year's presidential election. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.